All right, welcome back to the Mostly Cricket podcast, episode 2 of the long form videos, and obviously there's a lot going on at the moment in international cricket. I'm obviously going to focus on a few topics that I really want to go into depth into, but obviously, the main one at the moment is the men's Ashes series. England have officially lost the series. Australia retained the Ashes. They're 3-0 up at the moment, heading into the Boxing Day Test match, which starts in a few days. All the discussions around what's happened, what's led to this scoreline, largely fall on England and sort of the things that they could have done better, the things that maybe even if they had done better, it may still not have changed the result too much, given how strong and how sort of airtight this Australian side are at home. Especially, so much has been made of the preparation of the England side, the tactical side on field, the roles, the futures of Rob Key, the managing director, Brendon McCullum, obviously the coach, and Ben Stokes as captain. How that axis is quite a unique one in international cricket at the moment, given how close all three of them are. There's obviously some India, South Africa matches that have been going on, and I wanted to touch on specifically Virat Kohli's ODI series, which I know it's a little bit late, but it takes me onto a wider point that I want to go into about what makes him so good in one-day cricket in particular, but even white ball cricket just as a whole in T20 cricket, which I think it's been a little bit of a forgotten sort of string to his bow because of how T20 cricket is played nowadays and how sort of belligerent it's become. But I want to touch on what makes Virat Kohli so good in white ball cricket, and also I'll touch on the West Indies and what they were able to showcase in New Zealand, which I think there were a lot of positives. Obviously, New Zealand have ended up winning that series, but West Indies have I think put together a good account of themselves, especially in that first Test match. And I think again it's a glimpse that there's a lot of good in West Indies cricket on their day. It's just those occurrences are so infrequent. But what they showed in that first Test match was incredible, and I just want to give Justin Graves especially his flowers, because I think that innings that he played was incredible. So kicking off the first topic, and that is the topic of England's preparation and the key figures that probably had the most influence and bearing on sort of how England went about their preparation, not just since landing in Australia, but even the 4 years leading up to this. And the England men's cricket kind of has an interesting situation, especially in red ball cricket, because I don't think I've ever seen a side where the managing director, the captain and the coach are so kind of close and so aligned on almost the minutiae of how this team operates, from the day-to-day things, but also just the ideologies. It seems like a very kind of close-knit trio that there are pros and cons to it. I think a lot is going to be made of the cons of it, given how the series has gone and how the side has been performing in the recent past and the inconsistencies. But given that England have lost this Ashes 3-0 in 11 days, the inevitable thing with these away Ashes series for England is the whether they go down the route of wholesale changes, whether jobs are on the line, which you don't. It's not a nice thought. You don't want to, create content all the time on the possibility of people losing their jobs, because it's, we're all human trying to make a living. But with this particular situation and how close these three are within this axis, it makes for an interesting discussion, because I don't think England cricket have found themselves in quite this kind of a situation, at least not in the time I've been following English cricket. But Rob Key, Ben Stokes and Brendon McCullum have all had, in some way and in their own way, ways of trying to prepare this England side for this Ashes series. And I want to just go into each of their kind of what they probably had the most influence on in terms of the preparation, and whether it was maybe the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do, and looking forward, how can things be improved, or maybe certain things they've done that could be avoided if I guess a further 2.5, like 5 years from now, they they want to have a more realistic crack at winning the Ashes in Australia. So Rob Key, one of the things that he mentioned very early on, I think it was at the start of the 2024 county championship season, where obviously news came out that they were going to move Sir James Anderson on. And there was this kind of memo put out to the county championship bowlers, the pace bowlers, that and this is kind of somewhat paraphrasing, but we want bowlers that can bowl 87 miles per hour plus. Don't worry so much about the wickets, as long as the pace is there. That's what we want. And we've obviously seen since that summer in 2024, England really remodel their pace attack to include, or plan to bring all sorts of different kind of bowls that we've never really seen before into the group in one go. Obviously Jofra Archer had 4 years out, but he was the main guy I think everyone wanted fit for for the first test of this Ashes series. And when he's at his best, obviously he can bowl in excess of 90 miles per hour. Mark Wood is someone that has been playing consistently on and off. This year he had quite a long injury layoff, but he was another one that was earmarked for the series. And then guys like Gus Atkinson, Bryden Carse, Ben Stokes himself, after his various operations and recoveries from hamstring and shoulder injuries and so on, he seems to be able to hit high pace again when things are going well. So England had made it very clear in their minds, or certainly Rob Key was very clear in his mind, that he felt one of the areas where England could give themselves the best possible chance of competing in Australia was with high airspeed. There was a clip that was going around saying, of Rob Key saying that bowlers at test level who bowl at 75 miles per hour don't really work in test cricket. And I think what we found, not only in this series, but even when you look back at in history at test cricket, is those bowlers still do have room to thrive and have their place in a bowling attack. Even in Australia, you look at the Australian side at the moment. Scott Boland is probably the perfect example of that. He is probably Australia's most informed, most threatening bowler in Australia at the moment, and he only operates at 83, 84, maybe 85 miles per hour. Pat Cummins at Adelaide, we saw, obviously there's a caveat to it, because he was coming back from an injury layoff his back. He was maybe a little bit ginger and maybe didn't want to give everything all at once, but he was also only operating at about 84 miles per hour, 85 miles per hour, sometimes kind of building into spells in terms of pace. And we saw how successful he was on that Adelaide wicket, which was quite good for batting. We saw Michael Neser obviously in the G.O.A.T test, and again, the slight caveat in that it was a day-night match and the pink ball, so maybe the behavior of the ball under lights and so on is a bit different and a bit harder to face as a batter. But he again operates at sort of 78 to 82 miles per hour on average, and he got a fifer. Pace alone does not guarantee you wickets, guarantee you success. You still need skill and discipline allied with that pace. And even if you don't have the pace, I think skill and discipline will always trump some of these physical traits. And I think Australia have shown that. But even when you look back in test cricket at bowlers that have had success in Australia at various times, Vernon Philander, Sean Pollock, Glenn McGrath himself, obviously he had height to his advantage, but Glenn McGrath was not high pace. Maybe at one time he used to bowl at 87 miles per hour in his younger days, but when he reached that kind of legend status, he wasn't bowling that fast. He was, 82 to 84, 5 miles per hour. Someone like Muhammad Asif, I think when Pakistan went there in 2009-10, he had I think there was one match possibly at Sydney, he was just moving the ball, got, I think, a 6 for or something. And, he doesn't operate at huge, high pace. There are a whole host of bowlers that have done well in Australia by just relying more on skill and discipline than high pace. And the players that I've mentioned there, obviously on their own, they are a skill over speed type bowlers, but they are part of a wider attack which boasts an array of bowling attributes and traits. Obviously, someone like Glenn McGrath, he was part of an Australian attack that had guys like Brett Lee and Jason Gillespie who were quicker, who did offer something a little bit different. And obviously, you had Shane Warne, who's a great spinner. He is one cog in the overall wheel, and that inherent variety in that attack also made them very potent. You think of Vernon Philander, he was part of an attack that had Moeen Ali and Dale Steyn. Moeen Ali obviously much taller, gets more bounce, and is probably the quickest of all of them. Dale Steyn was someone that was sort of a mix of the two. He could bowl high pace, but he was also very skillful and could swing the new ball and kind of adjust it to conditions well. But it seemed like Rob Key he felt that high airspeed was the way to go, uniformly throughout the attack. And, I think one area where England's bowling attack has been criticised in the past is that it can be quite samey, in terms of having a lot of these right arm fast medium bowlers that can work in England when there's grass on the pitch and it's a little cloudy, but away from England where pitches might be flatter, or you need to extract bounce and hit the pitch harder, they haven't always been so successful. And so with that rationale, I guess he felt having 4 or 5 bowlers that could bowl high pace and hit the deck might be the way to go. But that also introduces a little bit of sameness, I think, into the attack, especially if it is only pace and the skill and discipline are not there. And I think that's what we've seen in this Ashes, at least in part. A lot of the bowling has been, well, for a start, a lot of the bowling has been very erratic, and some of the bowling plans have been very kind of, it's almost been too proactive. And that's something I'll come on to in a moment in terms of Ben Stokes and what he's done tactically in the series. But the bowlers have not helped themselves by being so ill-disciplined. But the pace has either they've all been very quick, or they've not been able to sustain that speed, and they've kind of dropped down to the kind of category that they were maybe trying to eradicate and avoid in the first place. And I think what we found is speed alone, especially in Australia against Australian batters who grow up against that kind of bowling, that alone is not enough. And I think as far as when you look at preparation, there's preparation that they've done since landing in Australia, but there's also preparation before they came to Australia and in the 3-4 years leading up to this. And I think this fixation with going down the route of only having high airspeed, and even kind of openly saying that to the county championship bowlers that we just want airspeed, I think that has been to the detriment of this England bowling attack. And it's even, I think, affected how they view spin and their use of spin. I think traditionally, certainly since Graeme Swann's retirement, England haven't really trusted spin and captained spin very well, or used spin or viewed spin as a genuine attacking option. And that is in part because Graeme Swann was an incredible bowler. He's the best England spinner I've seen since I've been watching cricket. I obviously didn't see guys like Jim Laker and those guys from back in the day live, but Graeme Swann was a very almost un-English kind of spinner. And to kind of compare current spinners to Graeme Swann, especially that finished product Graeme Swann that we saw between 2009 to 2012 would be unfair, because Graeme Swann at that stage was much older. He knew his craft inside out. So there's a little bit of kind of understanding there, but the way England are treating that position in the 11 for the spinner is, I think, leaving a lot to be desired. And again, I think it's that again, that fixation on high airspeed has impacted how they've used the spinner. 2 years out, they plucked Shoaib Bashir out of obscurity and wanted him to be that frontline spinner during the series, because of his height, because of the fact that some of what he did mirrored Nathan Lyon in some aspects, and the fact that he could maybe suit these conditions in a way that other county championship spinners who have been playing year in year out in England may not be able to. For whatever reason, they've seemed to have lost faith in Shoaib Bashir, and we can only speculate as to why that is. I guess behind the scenes he's not bowling that well. Obviously he struggled in some of the England Lions, the tour games, and what that means is that England are kind of veering into that territory they went down in 2014 after Graeme Swann retired, which is trying to fudge a batter into a frontline test spinner, which they did with Moeen Ali in 2014. And it overall, if you look at whether that worked, I would say, it was very hit and miss. I think Moeen Ali possessed a lot of natural talent, which meant that he did put in really good spells of bowling and did pick up those fifers from time to time. But there were also a lot of occasions where he just lacked control, and you could see the captains getting frustrated and not really trusting him with the ball. And I think we've seen Will Jacks in this test match. This was his first full proper opportunity to play as that frontline spinner, and what we saw is that he didn't possess the skills, the discipline, maybe even the patience to do what his opposite number Nathan Lyon was doing almost every time he bowled. And that is a big issue when you look at the bowling attack as a whole. You want variety in that attack, but that variety has to be of high skill, or at least good enough skill to at least hold up an end in test cricket. And Will Jacks as a long-term test match spinner, I don't think is the way to go for England. They need to invest in a proper frontline spinner and stick with them. And Shoaib Bashir seemed to be that guy, and for whatever reason they've lost faith in him. And that goes to a wider point about how Rob Key was viewing the county championship as a whole, and how maybe what happens in the county championship isn't a good indicator or a good predictor of what could happen at test level. And I agree with him to a degree, because the conditions in England, especially when you play county cricket, it can be very damp. The pitches can be very green. It's very cloudy, and seamers obviously are preferred. And so what happens in those county games may not reflect whether you will have success on a test quality pitch. However, first class cricket, county cricket in England's case, that is the breeding ground for, players across all the disciplines that cricket has to offer. That is where you get overs under your belt, runs under your belt. And there's so much kind of guesswork and taking a leap of faith as to whether some of these, left field selection policies will pay off. But when you have guys that have spent their careers focused solely on a particular discipline in county cricket, to kind of disregard them completely, and try and kind of fudge a guy that mainly identifies as a batter in Will Jacks and kind of make him a bowler, I think is kind of disrespectful to the guys in county cricket, but also is put Will Jacks in a really difficult position, because now he's having to shoulder the burden of a discipline that he has not worked on his whole life. and is now being asked to do it in some of the toughest conditions against the toughest opposition. And then when it doesn't work, he will get heavily criticized. It's a lose-lose situation. While the county championship and conditions in England will never mirror, conditions in Australia and South Africa and India, I still think there is some merit to investing in someone who has spent their entire professional careers focused on honing a particular craft. And I think in Test cricket especially, specialists play such a key role. It's not like in limited overs cricket where you can have these quote unquote bits and pieces cricketers that in an over here and an over there, they might get a wicket or they might hit a couple of sixes, and you might end up winning a game in such a condensed period of time. In Test cricket, you have to, bowl over after over, spell after spell, session after session, day after day, potentially, if the opposition are on top on a good batting wicket, and then back that up in the next Test match, and then again, and then again, and then again in the case of the Ashes, which goes on for 5 tests. And I think you need specialists, because Test cricket, I still think, is a format for specialists, because at the end of 5 days, at the end of 3 tests, 5 tests, usually when you look at the top wicket takers and the top run getters, it's the guys that you think will do well based on form and reputation and class. It's not the guys that were picked as a left field pick and they've somehow managed to string together 5 tests where they've scored multiple hundreds. It's usually the usual suspects that do well. And I think Test cricket needs specialists. You win big series, you win matches with specialists. And England, I think, need to invest in, if it's not Shoaib Bashir, another young spinner. You see on the county championship streams or on social media pages clips of various spinners bowling well, who are frontline spinners, who do well. So I guess there are options there. You just need to pick someone and stick with them. It makes you wonder, what happened to guys like Tom Hartley, who played in India at the start of 2024, and then and he bowled quite well on that tour. Yes, conditions were favoring spinners, but he bowled well and sort of has disappeared. Jack Leach, I guess, they trialed him and maybe he didn't quite work out. That's fine. You might trial someone and give them a good go and it might not work. That's fine. But I think England need to not go down this route of trying to fudge a batter into a specialist's role, because spinners that do well in Test cricket are specialists. That you don't win Test matches with a part-time off spinner always delivering. It's usually the guys that know their craft inside out that do well. So I don't see Will Jacks as a long-term spinner. I see him being someone that can play in this 11 and can offer handy overs of supplementary spin, but I don't see him as a frontline spinner. So I hope in time that relationship between the managing director or the Test team and the county championship, I hope there is a bit more harmony there, and they recognize the benefit of the domestic system. It might not be the perfect system, and I think there are a lot of issues in terms of planning and when the county championship happens that can impact when spinners bowl during a county season. But I think there needs to be a bit more respect given to the guys that have devoted their professional careers to bowling spin, in the case of this particular spin bowling position. And then the focus falls onto Brendon McCullum, the coach, obviously working down from the managing director to coach to the captain. Brendon McCullum, all sorts have been kind of made of his comments, in the years leading up to this series, but also during the series. Obviously, a lot of the talk about the preparation that has happened since arriving in Australia. After the G.O.A.T test, saying maybe they trained too much or with too much intensity, too close to the second test, and maybe that worked against them. And then after the Adelaide test, he sort of kind of admitted that he probably got preparation plans wrong, or they didn't do enough, or whatever it is, it was suboptimal. And then he also made some interesting comments which I found it really hard to make sense of, where, words to the effect of, we wanted the series, we wanted the Ashes so badly that we almost got in the way of ourselves and stymied our talent, which I don't 100% know what that means exactly, but there are clearly some areas where even he, as coach, is admitting that there have been some deficiencies, there have been some shortcomings, and the style of coach that he is, at least from what the players say, and just the kind of energy he exudes when he does these interviews, is that he's a very kind of big picture, philosophical, kind of people person, trying to uh, 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 put his attention on the human element of the cricket, as opposed to the technical stuff, and trying to make players feel welcome, accepted of who they are, and all that kind of stuff. Which, admittedly, at the point when he took over, I think that is what England cricket probably needed. It got to a stage, it felt that a lot of players were always looking over their shoulders, felt very kind of constrained in terms of, wanting to take risks and feeling like they would probably get a slap on the wrist and maybe even dropped if they messed up in trying to take those risks. And I think England cricket in general, there's always been a feeling at times that there's a bit too much coaching, technical coaching, that goes on, and it maybe kind of restricts them from being kind of adaptable in a range of conditions. And maybe that's why Robert Key liked what Brendon McCullum was saying at, I guess, his job interview, and I guess that's why Brendon McCullum really stepped into that kind of a persona, more than the technical side. And as I say, I think at the time when it started, it was what the England side needed. But I think, given the age profile of this England Red Bull side, and also the technical kind of deficiencies a lot of them have, I think there is scope to say that, whether it's Brendon McCullum, or whether it's Marcus Trescott, the batting coach, or whether it's someone else, there needed to be a bit more focus on maybe the technical stuff just as much as the mental things. And I think even the mental side, while there is, it is good that they try and make the players feel a lot more relaxed, I think maybe it's gone a bit too far, and at times they've been a little bit, maybe too loyal to some of the players, considering the outputs over a long period of time, which 4 years of Test cricket, considering how much Test cricket England play, that is quite a long, quite a big sample size, and maybe that has gone, he's given some of the players too much rope, and that's possibly, they haven't repaid that faith. There seems to be a line going around now, of England have underperformed in the series, and I think Rob Key and Stuart Broad both mentioned that England have kind of been playing at 20% in this series, and I like to try and look at things objectively, and I kind of took a moment and thought, has this been an England side underperforming, or has it been kind of on par with expectation? Because yes, I do agree in some areas England have underperformed quite dramatically. I think the bowling discipline is by far probably the worst in this Bazball era that I've seen consistently being delivered, spell after spell, test after test. I think that has been bad. And I think actually Ben Stokes' captaincy, and I'll come on to Ben Stokes as the next person I kind of look at, in this list from Key to McCullum to Stokes. But I think probably Stokes has had his worst series as captain, and I think as a tactical captain, and I think tactically he has, I think, gotten some things wrong, but I'll touch on that in a moment. But you look at the side and how they have done in terms of outputs. The top three batters were always a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes could be conditions dependent, and they're not always guaranteed to get you 50s or 100s. In the case of Zach Crawley, his career average is just over 30. I think it's 31, around that area. And you look at what he's averaging this series, it's, I think, mid 30s, 35ish. You look at Ollie Pope against Australia and in Australia, he was averaging sort of 15 to 17. In the series, I think he's averaging 20-ish, that kind of area. Ben Duckett, he has been consistent, more consistent than Pope and Crawley. But his USP was he doesn't leave balls outside the off stump as an opener, and that's a very kind of new way of opening the batting. But some people did have hesitation in fully saying that he was going to be successful on this tour because of the bounce and so on. And, he has been found wanting in that area. Then you look at, Joe Root, he got that 100 at the Gabba and checked that box. So that was great and a real positive and a step forward for him. But you look at some of the dismissals either side of that, it's been outside off stump. At Adelaide against Cummins, it was that old way of getting dismissed where the ball angles in and holds its line. And he kind of got out in a way that I think a lot of players, a lot of pundits were kind of saying that could be a weakness for Joe Root, and that has continued in the series. Harry Brook, his big issue was obviously his temperament, his situational awareness, and being able to play sensibly. And we've seen him kind of continue that trend. You think of that shot he played at the Oval against India. When him and Root were doing well in that partnership, and that kind of brought India back in the game. Those kind of shots, which he was being criticized for then, he's been doing throughout the series. So in a way, that is matching expectations. So when you look at that top six and the outputs, I don't think it is unreasonable to say that they have just played to expectation as a batting unit. And the overarching thing that had followed this batting unit around was that they have a tendency to throw the bat when they are on top and bring opposition back into the game. I mentioned that Oval Test match against India this summer. I think last summer in 2024 against Sri Lanka at the Oval, there was a similar instance, and they let Sri Lanka back in, or Sri Lanka played well and earned the right, but England kind of made it easy as well, and they ended up losing that test. I think there were a couple of instances in the 2023 Ashes series as well. So all of those things are things that we've seen in these first three tests of this series as well. So I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that this has happened. And again, going back to how this ties into McCullum, I guess he has been the one that has constantly been reinforcing these positive messages and saying, it's all right if you get out that certain way, that's fine. Go, essentially almost that feeling of go harder, don't feel scared, just keep doing what you're doing. But at some point you need accountability. You can't keep, getting out the same way, making the same errors, not accept that you are making those errors, continue to make those errors, and then be devastated when you've ended up 3-0 down, having made the same errors. And as a head coach, I think you have a responsibility to tell the players that this needs to change, or this maybe consider doing something differently. I think there's nothing wrong with that, especially given they've tried this strategy for quite a while. And, as the sample size was getting bigger and bigger, these trends were kind of lingering. As a head coach, I wouldn't feel bad about saying that, because, you want the players to be improving. You want the players to be learning. And as a head coach, I think that's probably part of your remit of you're tasked with trying to make the side better. You should leave the side in a better state than when you came into it. And I think that is a big part of the head coach. Even if McCullum acknowledges these things and tells the players that, you need to improve in certain areas, I don't think that's a negative thing. That shouldn't sap the positivity and optimism that they maybe have had for the last 4 years. It should be a good thing. It's the chance to make the players a bit more, that much more robust. And then it might give them more optimism going into some of these series in tougher conditions, because they know they've done the work technically and mentally to maybe have better success in tougher conditions. So I don't think it's a bad thing if if McCullum starts to do that. And obviously, the last person on this axis is Ben Stokes, who captaincy aside for a moment, he was always going to play as a fully functioning all-rounder again, but I think more of a bowling all-rounder these days. I think given he's had his surgeries and his body is a lot more kind of robust. I think his bowling has been a huge plus since he started doing it regularly, and we saw that at Perth. But I think the one area where he has, I think, fallen short has been in his captaincy and leadership in Test cricket, I guess, from what everyone says, but also just leadership in general, I guess, in whatever job you're in. It comes down to, I guess, the human aspect of it, the man management or people management side of things, and the emotional intelligence side of things, but also the other side of it is the subject matter expert, and in terms of cricket, the tactical awareness and shrewdness, and making the decisions on the field. And I think for a lot of the time he's been captain, the one area where everyone kind of praises him is in that human management, the human element, the emotional intelligence. The way he's spoken about the side for so long, backing players even through the thinnest of thins, I think has been really admirable. And it's the kind of leader I think this England side needed when Bazball started. Having people believing in themselves and having a captain that believes in you, I think that was huge. And the way he has brought in young players and championed them and kind of talks about them as though they've already played 100 tests and makes them believe like they're world beaters, I think that's all really positive and really good, for your captain to do. However, the other side that I think ultimately shapes cricket matches and cricket series slightly more is what you do on the field. It's ultimately the decisions you make when you execute plans, how you execute them. And I think, as I say, this series has probably been his worst series in terms of a tactical captain. He's I think at times he's been maybe too proactive. We've always seen him be a little bit proactive and moving fielders every other ball slightly to play around with angles and so on, and get in batters' eye lines and create some different things for the batter. But I think this series he's probably been maybe too kind of eager to move away from set bowling plans and sticking with certain plans for long enough, especially the top of off, fifth stump line plans that Australia have executed so well. It seems like they try it for a little bit and then almost immediately go to a different plan or a short ball plan. And then those plans, when they're not working, he sometimes sticks with them too long. And I think that has been the one area that I think England have really kind of let themselves down, because as I say, the batting, I think for me at least, was kind of expected, but the bowling, I do think they had some very skilled bowlers in this attack. But whether it's been the directive that have come from Stokes or whether it's just been an execution thing, they have let themselves down. And some of the bowling plans, which presumably do come from Stokes, have been very too proactive at times. And I think that has in part led to England finding themselves 3-0. As far as the bowling goes, I think Jofra Archer is really the only one that has enhanced his reputation and really had a good series so far. And he's also batted quite well as well. And even just across all 11 players, I think Jofra Archer is probably the one guy that can put his hand up and say, I've done what was asked of me and done what I could. I just haven't always had the support. So, Jofra Archer aside, I think the bowlers in general have not been great, and maybe that has been compounded by some of Stokes's captaincy. But another area which I mentioned in a previous video, that it almost felt like this whole Bazball thing was beginning to unravel in real time before our eyes. And I mentioned one of Ben Stokes's endearing qualities as a leader was that human element, and the fact that he was so supportive and so loyal, maybe at times too loyal to some of the players who were maybe not repaying the faith as consistently as he may have wanted. And from being always kind of steadfast and very consistent in what he said to people at the post-match presentations and other interviews, he suddenly came out after the G.O.A.T test and said, this isn't a side for weak men. And, as a player, if you're hearing that, I don't know what you would think when suddenly, after all this positivity, maybe at times erring on toxic positivity, it suddenly turned into, this, throwing that phrase of weak men. It kind of sort of came out of nowhere. And, I think it was just a sign of I guess, the occasion and the scoreline and everything kind of beginning to chip away at Ben Stokes, as it has done to all the kind of players and people in leadership in this England setup. And, it leaves England cricket in an interesting position, because obviously the big talking point will be what will happen with Stokes, McCullum and Key's positions after the series. Obviously after an Ashes series, there's always a turnover of some kind. And this time I find it really interesting because, as I said at the top of the show, I haven't ever come across a situation where, the MD, the coach, and the captain have been so kind of close in terms of exactly their vision for the side, even the kind of the mechanics of the day-to-day mechanics of what needs to be done to get to a certain place. Rob Key seems very involved, at least from the outside, than past MDs. You think of Ashley Giles, Chris Silverwood, and Joe Root. It's normal for the coach and captain to be very close because they work with each other on a day-to-day basis, and during tests on tour, they're together all the time. But for the MD to be so kind of involved, considering they obviously, the test team is just one thing in their remit. They probably have a whole bunch of other things to focus on, including white ball cricket and so on. But, having the MD be so involved, makes this decision after the series about whether they keep their jobs quite kind of interesting, because, as I say, this Bazball thing was a vision that all three of them were aligned on. And so, to remove one but leave two, the other two, I don't see how that would work. If Stokes remains captain, which I think he probably will, because he has still accomplished a lot of good things. It's just there's been a refusal to learn from the same mistakes, which I think has been his main criticism. You look at the rest of the side, there isn't really anyone that can be captain, really. I think Harry Brook, a lot has been made of him as a captain, but in the white ball side, of which he's captain, he has struggled to get positive results, and he just seems to be a player at that age where you just kind of need to leave him be and let him figure out what he needs to do at Test cricket to be successful and consistent. And I don't think adding captaincy to him is gonna help with that. And Joe Root, he's had his time. Everyone was clamoring by the end to remove him, so I don't see why he would come back in. So I don't see Stokes really going. McCullum, I think, he's spoken a lot about that he's learnt a lot on this tour, and that he's acknowledged that things could be done better and maybe the team needs to evolve. And that's good to hear that he's finally saying these things. But is it a little, is it too little too late? But at the same time, is there merit in allowing him to try and right the wrongs and start a new cycle for England Test cricket and try and implement the learnings? Maybe. But again, if McCullum goes and a new coach comes in who maybe wants to play Test cricket differently, but Stokes is still captain and he is still very much in the Bazball vision, or at least some variation of that Bazball vision, will you then have a situation where the captain and the coach are not seeing eye to eye, which can then lead to further rifts and potentially another coach having to come in? And, that's a very real possibility. And then obviously Rob Key, who I guess, again, was on the same page as Stokes and McCullum. If he goes, will the new MD see things the way McCullum and Stokes do? And again, you have that issue where maybe two of the three see eye to eye, but one doesn't, and that one might be the guy that has the most power in terms of decision making. So it's a really interesting situation, and I don't think I've seen a situation like this where all three have been in sort of in each other's pockets and have been so close that it's going to be hard to split them if they need to make some tough calls. But all in all, what we've seen on this tour has basically been that original Bazball blueprint has kind of been, at least in tougher bowling conditions, tougher batting conditions, bowler-friendly conditions, it's been sort of a castle built on sand in that, it's too one-dimensional, and and even the preparation side of things, as I say, the preparation on once they've arrived in Australia is one thing, but even going beyond that, in the 4 years, if England were putting all their eggs in the Ashes basket, the Ashes tour away to Australia basket, could more have been done with even the pitches, for example? Could we've seen for the last 2-3 years now pitches be so flat in England, and I don't know if that was to get runs under the batsmen's belts and make them feel capable of scoring bulk runs again, which wasn't the case towards the end of Joe Root's and Chris Silverwood's era, where the batters were really struggling. Was that the reason why? Is the reason because England like to chase in the fourth innings and that's why they do it? Well, if that's the case, again, that feeds into the strategy being too one-dimensional. But if they really wanted to give their batters, set their batters up for tougher bowling conditions, could they have made more of the pitches a bit more sporting at times? I mentioned in the last full episode that how much pitches play a part in Test cricket, and what might be good for a developing young player. Could England have made some more pitches that were in some way more batter friendly, bowler friendly, so then you could see if shot making is as easy or can be made more consistent even in tough conditions. Obviously you're not going to replicate Australian conditions in England, I know that, but some kind of a challenge for the batters could have been a useful thing, as part of the preparation, beyond what has just been happening since they've arrived in Australia. But as I say, the fact that England do focus a lot on the Ashes, I think at times is to the detriment of their chances in the Ashes, because you end up trying to, you focus on a few elements where you think it might work, it might set you up in Australia, and then you find that actually other areas become deficient because of that. When Sir Andrew Strauss's side won in 2010-11, yes, they had a really good side, but it was just a well-rounded side that could play in a whole range of conditions. Yes, again, player for player, comparing that side and this side, I don't think anyone will argue that side was the better, stronger side. Joe Root in this side is exceptional and probably could get in that side. Ben Stokes, if he's playing at his absolute best, probably could, but that side was just a really good, experienced, well-rounded side, and I don't think it's any surprise that because they look to just improve in all areas, at least it looked that way. It's no surprise that an Ashes series took care of itself in 2010-11. That's that side without Strauss, but it was the rest of them were still there. That side went on to win a series in India in 2012-13, and then they had a lot of success just against a lot of countries in a lot of conditions. So, I think there is something to said about wanting to just be a good, well-rounded side. I think because if you do that, you probably will, things like the Ashes will take care of itself, because in that journey of becoming a well-rounded side, you probably end up, being better at adapting to all situations or more situations. You get better at facing different kinds of bowlers, different kind of batters, and all of it. I think it all comes together. So I hope moving forward, England will try and kind of see the bigger picture a bit more, and because I think there is a lot of talent in this England side, but it's probably some of it is not being kind of harnessed in the optimal way. And I depending on what happens with McCullum, Key and Stokes, I hope the next cycle goes in a slightly different direction. And finally, the last point on England's campaign so far is, I think, the fact that, you know, they've sort of been brought back down to earth and reality has hit them. You know, I think this was a side that has at various points come out with a lot of kind of strange comments, and they've arrogance is something that can be a good thing in sports people. We've seen that trait be prevalent in a lot of great legends across all sports. In cricket, a lot of people say that Sir Viv Richards had a little bit of arrogance to him. Even in the great Australian side, there were players that had that kind of trait. But I think a lot of that was based on substance. It was on the back of a huge body of work in tough conditions against the toughest opposition consistently year in, year out. And I think this England side were very quick to almost demand that kind of respect, and kind of almost gaslight people into believing that they were better than they actually were. When you make comments like the one I think Ben Stokes made during that documentary that was based on the 2023 Ashes series, where I quote, and what we have managed to do is we've managed to become a sports team that will live forever in the memory of people who were lucky enough to witness us play cricket. That was just 1 year into Bazball, and I think that series, they ended up drawing that series. When you come out with comments that Ben Duckett came out with in India, when Yashasvi Jaiswal got a double hundred, and I think Duckett said something to the effect of, sometimes when you look at that innings like that, you've got to take a bit of credit for it yourself, based on because of maybe the way Bazball inspired him, even though Jaiswal had a reputation of playing that way already. When you in interviews and post-match presentations, as a captain, when you're quite kind of standoffish, and you say things sort of as though the rest of us don't get it. And when you refer to legends who are just trying to help out the current team and offer a little bit of advice, because they want their country to do well. And that patriotism, you want your team and your country to do well. And when you come out with just a little bit of friendly advice, and you're kind of told, oh, we don't need to listen to has-beens, all those kind of comments taken into consideration, and the fact that they make that the team has made the same mistakes again and again, and sort of refused to acknowledge it until in the last week or so. It's hard to sympathize with a team that kind of conducts themselves in that way, with the kind of results that they have kind of accrued over a period of time. Yes, this England side has done a lot of good things. I think that win in New Zealand at the end of last year was huge, because not many teams go to New Zealand and win, really, other than Australia. And even that narrative for a while, which was sort of, this England side was reinventing Test cricket. Considering some of the results in the recent past, and the fact that there's been a criticism of the side being very one-dimensional. It's. I just hope that this is a really good lesson for them, for everyone involved, and that they can bring a little bit more humility moving forward, because there's nothing wrong with having conviction and a vision, and being optimistic and wanting your side to do well. I think everyone wants that for the teams they support and the players playing in those teams, but to talk in the way that some people and from some quarters have kind of spoken, and not really back that up with results for long enough. I think this has been a really good lesson in humility for them, and I hope moving forward in the next cycle, whatever that looks like, and whoever's involved, I hope that England can learn from it, and look to get stronger and more consistent. It's a 3-match ODI series between India and South Africa in India. It's the main reason I want to talk about it is because obviously ODI, it's the only format Virat Kohli is now playing. The next ODI World Cup is a couple of years away in South Africa, I think. And obviously, there's so much talk. Indian cricket in general at the moment is in flux. It's in transition and in various aspects. But ODI cricket is the one format where both Virat Kohli and Rohit Sharma are still playing. And there's a bit of there's a sense of sort of unfinished business for Virat Kohli in ODI cricket, because it's the one thing that they haven't got, but that you would think that they would have won at this point. Since MS Dhoni's World Cup win, but since Virat Kohli became a real kind of superstar, that's the format that you would have thought that they would have won a World Cup in, and they haven't yet. And you just get the feeling that he wants to make sure that he gives that trophy one last good crack in a couple of years' time. But given the fact that the team is in transition, there's so much talk, from the selectors, Ajit Agarkar, about the futures of Kohli and Sharma, and how they'll take it as a performance by performance basis. They're being non-committal about whether Kohli and Sharma are definitely going to play, and that they're just they want them to be performing almost the whole time in the lead up to that World Cup. Well, in Virat Kohli's case, what he's done in this series is just it's like it's the same Virat Kohli from 10 years ago. 302 runs in 3 matches, 200s, 150, and his numbers at the moment are just, in one-day cricket, it's hard to explain just how good he is. I think he's easily, for me, the greatest ODI batter of all time. And I know it can be hard to sort of compare batters or players from different eras, especially in ODI or limited overs cricket, because at various points there were different restrictions and different rules in place which have evolved. Things like there used to be 1 ball per innings, which meant reverse swing was more of a thing at the death, making batting harder. But a little while later, it was 2 balls, 1 at each end, which meant reverse swing wasn't much of a thing. So it can be hard to compare, I know, but I just think Virat Kohli has demonstrated he has sort of a game for all situations, and his T20 kind of prowess and career, I think, is wildly underrated, because obviously T20 cricket, as we know it now, is way more belligerent and way more kind of six heavy than it was in the 2010s, when Virat Kohli played most of his cricket, most of his T20 international cricket. But I think you've got to remember the era of T20 cricket he was playing, and the style of cricket that was being played in T20 cricket when he was sort of in his prime in the 2010s and maybe early 2020s. And I think the that anchor role, which now gets a kind of a bad rap because teams want to load the 11 with batters that can all hit sixes. You see scores of 250 plus, 280, 300 being the target these days. But when Kohli was playing, it was 180, 190 was a tough score, and on a really good day, 220, 230 was probably what you were going to get when everything went according to plan. But Kohli has that anchor role. There's no one better than him at playing that role. In that number 3 position, where if the openers have gotten off to a good start, he comes in and just continues that momentum. But if the openers have gotten out early and maybe there's been another wicket, you've got to consolidate, you've got to kind of accumulate a few runs and build, and then kind of kick on from there. And Virat Kohli, I think his ability to do that in T20 cricket and expand his stroke play as the innings went on, I think was a big part in him also being so good in ODI cricket, because he had all elements of the game to be able to thrive in a format that is just a little bit longer, and you've just got to do those things for longer, if you see what I mean. And the fact that as he's gotten older, he's now beginning to hit more sixes, and maybe playing in the IPL in a bit more of that modern era in the last 5 years, I think that's probably helped him be a bit more expansive and not be shy to go for some sixes, because he practices it a lot more now. And I think that's why I say he is the best kind of white ball batter, that has ever played, in my opinion. I know it's a little bit hard to compare eras, given there were some, there were rule changes have been more of a thing in limited overs cricket than in red ball cricket. There were times where there was a time where, one white ball was used per innings, so reverse swing was more of a thing, and so batting was harder at the death, and hitting sixes was much harder. And then as time went on, they trialed two balls, one at each end, so then reverse swing wasn't a thing as much, if at all. And now they've kind of tried to find a middle ground. So, I understand comparing batters of different eras is not always wise, but I think if Virat Kohli is someone that has the game to accumulate runs when needed, to hit fours all around the park when needed, and to hit sixes when he wants, sometimes big sixes, when he wants, when he decides to. And I think all of those things, I don't think there's been a batter. I think maybe only AB de Villiers is the closest, or the one that can really kind of push him for that title. But I think Virat Kohli has just done it for longer. So I think just by virtue of that, he goes above AB de Villiers. But, I don't think there's anyone that's been able to play all three styles as consistently as Virat Kohli over the last 15 years. As I say, AB de Villiers is the closest one. And, maybe in T20 cricket, I think it's fair to say AB de Villiers is the better T20 player. And, in Test cricket, if you're just looking at Virat Kohli as sort of an overall batter, I think, again, it's fair to say, all formats, sort of averaging all formats, Virat Kohli has been the best all-format batter in the last certainly 10 years. Again, I think AB de Villiers is the one that challenges him most in that regard. I think AB de Villiers, sometimes his Test record kind of gets forgotten because of how good he was in white ball cricket. But Virat Kohli is that guy, and I know his Test career probably didn't end in the way people wanted. He had 5 years where it was quite a struggle to watch him play. It reminded me a lot of Ricky Ponting towards the end of his Test career, where he maybe held on a little bit too long. And it was kind of sad to see. And a lot of people kind of remembered Ricky Ponting for those last few years, as opposed to the 10, 15 years before that. But you look at Virat Kohli's numbers in Tests, he still finished with an average of 46.85, 30 hundreds. Those are numbers that guys that only play Test cricket, some Test match specialists, end up with. The fact that Virat Kohli ended with that even after 5 years of not playing that great shows that he was, that there was a time where he was just incredible. And I do feel like, if you ask me, in Test cricket, probably he wasn't in the topmost echelon of like batters. I do think that he probably had one or two too many technical issues that probably held him back from being in that, Sachin Tendulkar, Jack Callis, tier. But he still found a way for a lot of his career to, maybe it was through hard work and just sheer determination, to score prolifically despite those technical issues. But I think by the end, it did become a little bit kind of rinse and repeat in terms of how he was getting out in Test match cricket. But in one day cricket, I don't think there's any kind of glaring weakness. There's no place, bowlers really can target him, or no area of the ground that, if they put fielders there, he'll be blocked off and he can't score, because he is so well-rounded. He can hit everywhere around the wicket. As I say, he runs between the wickets well. I think I saw a stat recently where I think 55% of his runs in ODI cricket have come in ones, twos, or threes. You don't do that without having just an all-round game. And also you don't do that without being supremely fit. I think that's one thing Virat Kohli does. One thing about Virat Kohli that doesn't get mentioned enough and that is his fitness. To me, he is the perfect example of what cricket fitness is. I think a lot of players and people label certain players as very fit, but they're still extremely injury prone. Despite that tag. I think, when was the last time Virat Kohli, injured injured his groin or tore a calf or strained a hamstring just by sort of doing cricket things. I really can't remember it. The fact that he's mid-30s and still running hard between the wickets, and still hitting sixes and fours and fielding like he did 10 years ago, for me, it's no question that he is the best white ball batter that has ever played. Like I said, AB de Villiers is probably a close second in terms of all round. I just think because Kohli has done it a little bit longer and has maintained that standard in white ball cricket, he for me is just above AB de Villiers. But imagine a batting order with Kohli 3, de Villiers 4. I mean, I think you'd be pretty happy with that. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was the New Zealand-West Indies series, which just concluded. New Zealand won the Test series 2-0. And, I don't think anyone was surprised with that result. I think, New Zealand obviously playing at home, the reputation, I guess the availability of players consistently and just the form and the momentum that they've had for a while, it would have taken a huge effort for West Indies to win the series. But their performance in the first test, I wanted to focus on that specifically because that was just an incredible moment, I think, in Test cricket because, this West Indies side, West Indian cricket in general has struggled. I don't think it's unfair to say, like, West Indies cricket has been slowly on the downward trajectory for a variety of reasons, but it has been struggling for a while, and it's sad because you think of where West Indies was once upon a time, and they were the team to be and to beat back in the day, but for whatever reason it's been a struggle and it continues to be a struggle. But since the start of 2024, there have been these moments that have been sprinkled in here and there that just suggest that this West Indies side are capable of some incredible things. You think back to the G.O.A.T test against Australia in, I think, January 2024, where Shamar Joseph got, I think, a 7-for, and they won and technically drew that series in Australia. You think of when I think Kavem Hodge and Athenaze batted really well for, I think, a day in England in the English summer. And it was everyone was talking about how promising these young batters looked, and they had smiles on their faces, and it was just a really great moment. And it was a tough series in the end. I think England won 3-0, but it was a moment again where we saw young West Indian batters standing up and doing really well. You think of what they did in Pakistan at the beginning of the year with Jamal Warrican taking all those wickets, and they drew the series in Pakistan, with spin as their main weapon. And then you come to the first test here in New Zealand where you're set 531 to win in the fourth innings, 120 runs more than the highest successful run chase ever in test history. That too by the West Indies, by the way. And, and it's away from home, and you manage to get to kind of within touching distance of that score, 457 for 6, I think, in the end. And you've got Shea Hope getting 100, Justin Graves getting 202 not out, I think, something like that. And Kemar Roach getting a 50 as well, and playing out so many balls. Yes, the pitch was, I guess, quite batting friendly, but to still do that and play out that much time and do it, especially when the side has been struggling just in general. And, I think these are the moments that West Indian cricket needs to I just keep them believing, because I do think the frequency of these kind of performances are increasing slowly. I think between those performances, there's still a lot of, a lot of poor cricket, and, at times maybe teams just being stronger. But I do think that their ability to do some particularly exceptional things, even if it is short-lived, I think that frequency is increasing slightly. I think the West Indies have quite a good bowling attack when everyone is fit. Kemar Roach, Jaden Seals is really good, and they have a couple of spinners now that are really, really handy. And the batters, I think Justin Graves is a really good find. Even in against Australia when that series where Mitchell Starc blew them away in, I think, the last Test match. Justin Graves on some tough pitches looked quite good. And again in India recently, where India overwhelmed the West Indies team, but Justin Graves had some moments where he looked really good as a batter, and technically just really sound. And I don't think it's a surprise that he's scored this double hundred, to be honest. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that about the West Indies team, because as I say, they've gone through a lot of hard times, and they are continuing to go through some hard times. But these moments in that list that I mentioned earlier, I think those moments are what will keep them believing, and I hope that the frequency of those moments just keeps going on the rise, because I think everyone wants to see a strong West Indies side again, because when they play well, they're so exciting to watch. So they have their own kind of style, as all countries. I think that's what makes Test cricket so good, is that different countries have their own kind of style and feel to it. And a Test cricket landscape with a strong West Indies side, or a West Indies side that are competing much more regularly, I think is just a richer product. So I just wanted to mention that. But New Zealand, again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Devon Conway and Tom Latham getting twin hundreds each in that last Test match. Again, New Zealand doing what I guess New Zealand always do, and just kind of quietly go about their work, but rack up the wins. So I think this was an interesting series, because, as I say, it was on paper a mismatch, and in the end, New Zealand have won. But West Indies, I think, in that first Test match, I think they should be really buoyed by that, and I hope, as I say, that the frequency of those incredible moments just starts to keep going up, because we all want West Indies cricket to be strong. Well, that brings to an end today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a little bit longer than usual, but I just wanted to get into the weeds with some of these discussion points. And if you have any comments and thoughts, please leave them in the comments section. But if you liked what you heard, leave a like, subscribe, share, and I'll be back with you for the fourth Ashes Test at the MCG with the dailies. And yeah, until then, take care and have a great Christmas if you celebrate it.